The sound of gunshots echoed through the night as Thalia Scott pressed her body against the cold, damp earth beneath the wooden porch, each labored breath sending sharp pains through her side where blood seeped through her torn dress. The journey had been brutal miles of running through unfamiliar terrain, the wound in her side threatening to bring her down with each step. Now, as rain began to patter against the wooden planks above her, she prayed that whoever owned this isolated cabin wouldn't discover her before morning light gave her a chance to move on. Jackson Winters returned to his cabin on the outskirts of Truckee, California, bone-tired from a long day of cattle driving. The year was 1878, and the railroad's arrival had transformed the once quiet Sierra Nevada settlement into a bustling lumber town. Still, his modest ranch sat far enough away to maintain the solitude he preferred after 8 years of building a life away from his troubled past in Missouri. As he dismounted his chestnut mare, Storm, something caught his attention: subtle disturbances in the mud near his porch steps that didn't match the pattern of rainfall. Jackson's hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver on his hip as he approached cautiously, his spurs jingling softly with each step. The night was unusually cool for June, and the rain had picked up, drumming against the roof of the porch. Jackson crouched down, peering into the darkness beneath the wooden slats. What he saw made him freeze, a pair of terrified eyes staring back at him from the shadows. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said softly, keeping his hands where they could be seen. "But you're bleeding on my property, and that makes you my concern." Thalia tried to push herself further into the darkness, but the pain in her side flared, causing her to gasp. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain, "they'll kill me if they find me." Jackson's brow furrowed, but he didn't press for details. "Can you move? I've got medicine inside, and it's a sight warmer than down there." When she didn't respond, he added, "Madam, I don't know what trouble you're in, but you'll die from that wound or the cold if you stay put. I give you my word as a man of this territory that no harm will come to you under my roof." Something in his steady gaze must have convinced her, because after a moment's hesitation, Thalia attempted to crawl forward. The movement proved too much, however, and she collapsed with a whimper of pain. Without hesitation, Jackson lowered himself and carefully reached under the porch, gently pulling her into the open. The light from his porch lantern revealed a young woman, perhaps 22 or 23, with matted auburn hair and a once fine dress now torn and caked with mud and blood. A nasty gash ran along her right side, still seeping blood. "What's your name?" he asked, lifting her as carefully as he could. "Thalia," she managed, her eyes struggling to remain open. "Thalia Scott. I'm Jackson Winters," he replied, carrying her toward his cabin door. "And whatever you're running from, Miss Scott, you're safe now." Inside, the cabin was simple but well-maintained. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its embers still glowing from earlier in the day. Jackson placed Thalia gently on his bed, the only one in the one-room dwelling, and quickly stoked the fire back to life. "I need to see that wound," he said, retrieving a box of medical supplies from a trunk. "My pa was a doctor back east, taught me enough to keep myself alive out here." Thalia nodded weakly, the loss of blood evident in her pallor. "Side pocket," she murmured, gesturing vaguely to her dress. "Bullet grazed me." Jackson found the tear in her dress and carefully examined the wound. "You're right, it's a graze, but it's deep. You've lost a fair amount of blood." He reached for a bottle of whiskey. "This will hurt." She gripped the bedsheet as he cleaned the wound, her knuckles turning white but not a sound escaping her lips. Jackson worked methodically, disinfecting and then stitching the wound closed before bandaging it with clean cloth. "You're tougher than most men I know," he commented as he finished. "Most would have been hollering to wake the dead." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Not my first time being patched up." "That's concerning," Jackson replied, pouring her a small measure of whiskey. "Drink this. It'll help with the pain." Thalia took the glass with shaking hands and sipped cautiously. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier than before. "I can't pay you, but I didn't ask for payment," he interrupted, pulling a chair beside the bed. "But I do need to know if whoever did this is likely to come looking. I've got livestock to protect, and now you, Thalia's eyes darkened. They might. Thomas Blackwell and his men, they are after something they think I have. And do you have it? She hesitated, then reached into her bodice and withdrew a small leather pouch. Land deeds, to silver mines north of here. My father was murdered for them 3 days ago. Jackson's expression remained neutral, but his eyes hardened. So you ran. I fought first, she corrected, a flash of defiance in her eyes. Shot one of them before I fled. That's when they winged me. A woman who can shoot, Jackson mused. You're full of surprises, Miss Scott. Just Thalia, she said, exhaustion creeping into her voice. I've left Miss Scott behind in Sacramento. Jackson nodded, standing to prepare a makeshift bed for himself near the fire. Get some rest, Thalia. We'll figure out our next steps come morning. As he settled in for the night, Jackson found himself studying the woman's sleeping form, wondering what twist of fate had brought her to his doorstep. 8 years of solitude had suited him just fine, but something told him his peaceful existence was about to change dramatically. Morning came with gentle rain still pattering against the cabin roof. Jackson woke before dawn, as was his habit, and found Thalia still asleep, her breathing steadier than it had been the night before. He moved quietly, preparing coffee and a simple breakfast of biscuits and dried venison. The aroma eventually roused her. Thalia's eyes fluttered open, momentary panic flashing across her face before recognition set in. Morning, Jackson said, pouring a cup of coffee. How's the side feeling? Thalia slowly pushed herself up, wincing but managing to sit upright. Better than it has any right to, she admitted. Your father taught you well. He brought the coffee to her along with a plate of food. Eat, you need strength. As she ate, Jackson sat across from her, studying her in the morning light. She was striking, with intelligent green eyes and features that spoke of resilience. The kind of beauty that wasn't diminished by mud or hardship. We need to change that bandage, he said after she'd finished eating. Then we should talk about what happens next. Thalia nodded, allowing him to check her wound. The stitches had held, and there was no sign of infection, a small miracle given the conditions of her flight. You said these men might come looking, Jackson continued as he applied fresh bandages. How many are we talking about? Blackwell travels with 4 men, she replied. One of them I shot in the shoulder. If they tracked me this far north from Sacramento, they'd have reached Truckee by now. And they'd be asking questions, Jackson added thoughtfully. Town's small enough that strangers get noticed. I can't stay here, Thalia said firmly. I've put you in danger just by being under your roof. Jackson stood, crossing to the window to scan the horizon. You wouldn't make it 5 miles in your condition. And these men, they're not the law, are they? No, she answered bitterly. Blackwell is a businessman with powerful friends, but what he's doing trying to steal my father's claims, that's against the law. So why not go to the sheriff in Truckee? Thalia's laugh was harsh. My father tried that in Sacramento. The sheriff there took Blackwell's money and looked the other way when they came for us. Her voice broke slightly. I watched from a hiding place as they shot him in our own home. Jackson was silent for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he turned back to her. I've got a friend who rides for the law in Nevada territory. Man named Elliot Porter. If we can get these deeds to him, he might be able to help make them legal and binding before Blackwell can contest them. That's at least a 2-day ride, Thalia pointed out. 3 with you injured, Jackson corrected. But we've got another problem first. I need supplies from town if we're making that journey, and I can't leave you alone here, not in your condition. Thalia's brow furrowed. So what do we do? Jackson thought for a moment. I've got a root cellar. Well hidden. If anyone comes while I'm gone, you hide there. You do that for me, Thalia asked, genuine surprise in her voice. You don't even know me. Jackson met her gaze steadily. I know enough. No one deserves to be hunted like an animal, especially not for something that's rightfully theirs. He paused. My pa used to say a man's character is judged by what he does when no one's watching. I reckon helping you is the right thing to do. Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, a connection neither had anticipated. Thank you, Thalia said softly. Don't thank me yet, Jackson replied with a slight smile. We've still got to get out of this alive. Jackson spent the next hour showing Thalia the root cellar, a small space beneath the cabin floor accessed via a trapdoor hidden under a rug, and preparing for his trip to town. He changed into his least worn shirt and vest, wanting to appear unremarkable. "I'll be back by midday," he promised, checking his revolver before holstering it. "Keep the shotgun close, but use the cellar if you hear anyone approach." Thalia nodded, now dressed in one of his shirts that swallowed her smaller frame. "Be careful," she said. "They're dangerous men." "So am I when provoked," Jackson replied simply, then headed out to saddle Storm. The ride to Truckee took less than an hour, the town coming to life as morning advanced. The Sierra Nevada mountains loomed in the distance, still capped with snow despite the summer month. The town itself had transformed dramatically since Jackson had first settled in the area. What had once been a small trading post was now a proper settlement, with lumber mills operating at full capacity since the railroad's arrival. Jackson tethered Storm outside the general store and stepped inside, nodding to the proprietor, an older man named Harold Wells. "Morning, Winters," Harold greeted him. "Wasn't expecting to see you for another week or so." "Change of plans," Jackson replied casually. "Need some supplies for a trip." As he gathered provisions, coffee, flour, beans, ammunition, he kept his ears open to the conversations around him. It didn't take long before he heard what he was dreading. 5 of them, asking all over town about a woman, one of the mill workers was saying to another. Offering good money for information too. Jackson focused on selecting a new shirt that might fit Thalia while straining to hear more, said she stole something valuable. One of them had his arm in a sling, looked mad enough to chew iron and spit nails. "They checked the hotel?" the other worker asked. "First place they looked, been all through town since yesterday afternoon." Jackson brought his purchases to the counter, maintaining a neutral expression. "Sounds like excitement," he commented. "Not often we get strangers stirring up trouble." Harold shrugged as he tallied the items. "Well-dressed strangers at that. Leader's a sharp one, Thomas something. Offered Sheriff Davis $20 just to keep an eye out." "That's generous," Jackson remarked, paying for his goods. "They say what this woman looks like. Young, auburn hair, apparently wounded." Harold looked up at Jackson with raised eyebrows. "You see anyone matching that description out your way?" Jackson shook his head. "Just me and the cattle, Harold. Been that way for years." He gathered his supplies. "Though if they're still in town, might be worth introducing myself. Could use that reward money." Harold chuckled. "They're staying at the hotel." "Can't miss them. The fancy one's got a red vest that probably cost more than my monthly earnings." Jackson thanked him and headed out, careful not to appear too hurried. He made one additional stop at the livery stable, purchasing a second horse, a sturdy bay gelding, explaining to the stable master that he needed an extra mount for the cattle drive he was planning. As he was preparing to leave town, a voice called out to him from the boardwalk. "You there, Cowboy?" Jackson turned to see a well-dressed man with a neatly trimmed beard striding toward him, flanked by 2 rough-looking companions. The red vest identified him immediately. "Yes, sir," Jackson replied, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "Thomas Blackwell," the man introduced himself with the confidence of someone used to his name opening doors. "I understand you have a ranch outside of town." "That I do," Jackson confirmed, keeping his expression neutral. "Jackson Winters, Mr. Winters," Blackwell smiled without warmth. "I'm looking for a young woman who may have passed through these parts, a thief, I'm afraid, who's taken something quite valuable from me." "That's so," Jackson scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Can't say I've seen any women out my way. Don't get many visitors, period, being as isolated as I am." Blackwell studied him carefully. "She's injured, might have been seeking help." Jackson shook his head. "Wish I could help you, Mr. Blackwell, but it's just been me and my livestock. If I do see anyone, where might I find you to collect on that reward I heard about?" "We're at the hotel," Blackwell replied, his gaze still assessing Jackson. "Planning to stay until we find her." "Well, good luck to you," Jackson said, mounting Storm. "I'll keep an eye out." He tipped his hat and turned his horses toward the road leading out of town, feeling Blackwell's eyes on his back the entire way. Once out of sight of town, Jackson urged the horses into a gallop. He needed to get back to Thalia as quickly as possible. Blackwell didn't strike him as a man who took things at face value, and Jackson's gut told him they might have visitors sooner rather than later. When he reached the cabin, he called out before entering, not wanting to startle Thalia. "It's Jackson, I'm back." The trapdoor to the root cellar opened and Thalia emerged, shotgun still in hand. She looked relieved to see him. "You were gone longer than expected," she said. "Had to make an extra purchase," Jackson explained, gesturing toward the bay gelding outside, "and I ran into your friend Blackwell." Thalia's face paled. "He's in Truckee," Jackson nodded grimly as he began unpacking supplies. "Him and his men, they're offering rewards for information on your whereabouts." He met her worried gaze directly. "We need to leave tonight." "They didn't follow me, but I wouldn't put it past them to check out every ranch and homestead in the area." "But your home," Thalia protested. "Your cattle, you'd leave it all behind." Jackson paused in his preparations. "The cattle can graze freely for a while, as for the cabin." He glanced around at the simple dwelling. "It's just wood and nails, I can build another." "Why would you do this for me?" Thalia asked, genuine confusion in her voice. "You're risking everything for a stranger." Jackson's expression softened slightly. "Maybe I'm tired of being alone out here. Or maybe I just can't stand by while someone innocent gets hunted down." He returned to sorting supplies. "Besides, 3 days to Nevada help you secure your claim, then I can come back. It's not forever." Thalia watched him work, something shifting in her expression. "Thank you," she said simply, but the words carried weight. They spent the next few hours preparing for their journey. Jackson showed Thalia how to load and fire the revolver he was giving her, impressed by how quickly she picked it up. "My father believed women should know how to protect themselves," she explained as she practiced her draw. "He taught me to shoot when I was 16. "Smart man," Jackson commented, adjusting the saddle on the bay gelding. "This horse is yours now, name's Cooper. He's steady and won't spook easily." As evening approached, they packed their supplies onto the horses and prepared to depart. Jackson took one last look around his cabin, memorizing the simple space that had been his home for nearly a decade. "We'll head east through the mountains," he explained as they mounted their horses. "Less traveled route, might add a day to our journey, but we're less likely to encounter Blackwell or his men." Thalia nodded, grimacing slightly as she settled into the saddle, her wounded side clearly paining her despite the fresh bandage Jackson had applied. "You going to be able to ride?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "I'll manage," she replied with determination. "I've endured worse." They set out as dusk fell, the mountains looming ahead, painted purple and gold by the setting sun. Jackson led them away from the main trails, following game paths that wound through the dense pine forests covering the lower slopes. They rode in silence for several hours, pushing their mounts as much as they dared in the fading light. When full darkness made further travel dangerous, Jackson found a small clearing sheltered by large boulders. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he decided, helping Thalia dismount. Her face was drawn with pain, but she didn't complain. "No fire tonight, can't risk the smoke being spotted." They ate a cold meal of jerky and biscuits, huddling close for warmth as the mountain air grew chilly. The stars emerged overhead, brilliant and countless in the clear night sky. "I've never seen so many stars," Thalia remarked, gazing upward. "In Sacramento, the city lights dim them." "One advantage of living away from civilization," Jackson replied, following her gaze. "Out here, you never forget how small you are." "Is that why you chose this life?" Thalia asked. "The solitude," Jackson was quiet for a moment before answering. "Partly left Missouri after the war, too many memories there." He paused. "My family had a farm, lost it all when raiders came through. I was away fighting at the time." "I'm sorry," Thalia said softly. "It was a long time ago," Jackson replied, though his voice suggested the wounds hadn't fully healed. "What about you? Your father was a miner," Thalia shook her head. "An engineer. He designed more efficient ways to extract silver and gold. The mines he owned were ones he improved, taken as payment from owners who couldn't pay his fees." She touched the pouch containing the deeds. These represent his life's work, and Blackwell wants them because they're valuable," she said simply. "And because my father refused to sell to him. Thomas Blackwell doesn't like being told no." Jackson studied her profile in the starlight. "You should try to get some sleep. I'll take first watch." Thalia started to object, but then nodded, exhaustion evident in her movements as she wrapped herself in a blanket and lay down on the hard ground. "Wake me in a few hours. You need rest too." Jackson agreed, though he had no intention of waking her until dawn. He settled with his back against a boulder, revolver across his lap, and watched as Thalia quickly fell into sleep. In the quiet night, surrounded by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional call of a night bird, Jackson found himself wondering at the strange turn his life had taken. 2 days ago, his biggest concern had been a fence line needing repair. Now he was fleeing his home with a wounded woman, pursued by murderers. Yet somehow he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Dawn broke with a spectacular display of color over the eastern horizon, the mountains silhouetted against a sky painted in hues of pink and gold. Jackson, who had maintained his vigil through the night, gently woke Thalia as the first rays of sunlight reached their campsite. "We need to move," he said softly. "How's your side?" Thalia winced as she sat up but nodded resolutely. "I'll manage." After a quick breakfast of jerky and the last of the biscuits, they saddled the horses and continued their journey eastward. The terrain grew steeper as they ascended into the mountains, following narrow trails that wound through dense forests of pine and fir. "These mountains have claimed many who weren't prepared," Jackson commented as they navigated a particularly treacherous stretch. "The Donner Party got trapped not far from here back in '46. "I remember reading about that," Thalia replied, holding tight to Cooper's reins as the gelding picked its way carefully along the path. "A cautionary tale about the dangers of wilderness and winter. And poor planning," Jackson added. "Though we're not much better off if Blackwell's men catch up to us." They rode in companionable silence for several hours, the exertion of the journey and the pain of her wound keeping Thalia focused on staying upright in the saddle. By midday, they had climbed high enough that the air had thinned noticeably, and patches of snow still lingered in the shadowed areas despite the summer month. Jackson called a halt beside a small stream, helping Thalia dismount. She was paler than before, and he could see her shirt was stained with fresh blood where her wound had reopened. "Let me see it," he insisted, helping her sit on a fallen log. Thalia didn't protest as he carefully lifted the edge of her shirt to examine the wound. 2 of the stitches had torn and the area was inflamed. "This needs to be cleaned and restitched," Jackson said grimly. "Not here," Thalia replied, looking around at the exposed mountainside. "We're too vulnerable." Jackson reluctantly agreed. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 hours' ride from here. Friend of mine uses it sometimes. We can tend to you there." They continued their journey, but Jackson kept a closer watch on Thalia, noting how she swayed slightly in the saddle as the hours passed. When they finally reached the small cabin nestled in a grove of aspens, she was barely conscious. The cabin was little more than a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow cot, but it was shelter. Jackson helped Thalia inside and eased her onto the cot before quickly starting a fire in the hearth. "This is going to hurt," he warned as he prepared to clean and restitch her wound. Thalia nodded weakly. "Just do what you need to." Jackson worked with careful precision, cleaning the wound with whiskey from his flask before threading a needle. Thalia gripped the edge of the cot, her knuckles white, but made no sound as he sewed the torn flesh closed again. "You're the strongest woman I've ever met," he commented as he finished, applying a fresh bandage. Thalia managed a small smile. "Necessity breeds strength, Mr. Winters." "Jackson," he corrected. "After all we've been through, I think we're past formalities." She nodded, her eyes drifting closed as exhaustion claimed her. "Jackson," she murmured before falling asleep. He watched her for a moment, struck by how vulnerable she looked in sleep, the fierce determination that animated her features giving way to a gentler aspect. Something protective stirred in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Shaking himself from his reverie, Jackson set about securing the cabin. He unsaddled the horses and led them to a small meadow behind the structure where they could graze, then gathered more firewood and examined their supplies. They had enough food for 2 more days if they were careful. Water wasn't a concern with the stream nearby, but Jackson worried about Thalia's condition. The fever that often accompanied wounds like hers hadn't set in yet, but that didn't mean they were in the clear. As evening fell, he prepared a simple stew using dried beans and the last of his salt pork. The aroma eventually roused Thalia, who awakened looking more alert than she had earlier. "How long was I asleep?" she asked, carefully pushing herself up to a sitting position. "A few hours," Jackson replied, bringing her a tin cup of water. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by cattle," she admitted, sipping the water gratefully. "But my head's clearer." "Good." Jackson ladled some stew into a bowl and brought it to her. "You need to eat to keep up your strength." As they ate in the warm glow of the fire, a comfortable silence settled between them. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling around the eaves of the small cabin and carrying the promise of rain. "Tell me about your ranch," Thalia said after a while. "What made you choose that particular spot?" Jackson considered the question. "The view," he finally answered. "First time I rode up that valley and saw the mountains in the distance, something just settled in me, felt right." He paused, remembering. Land was cheap then, railroad hadn't come through yet. "Built the cabin myself, added to the herd each year." "You built a good life," Thalia observed. "A solitary one," he corrected, "but peaceful mostly." "And now I've disrupted that peace," she said, regret evident in her voice. Jackson shook his head. "You didn't choose this trouble, Thalia. Blackwell forced your hand when he killed your father." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and rain began to patter against the cabin's roof. "We should rest while we can," Jackson suggested, banking the fire for the night. "Storm might delay us tomorrow, but it'll also wash away our tracks." He prepared a makeshift bed for himself on the floor near the hearth, insisting that Thalia keep the cot. "You're injured," he said firmly when she protested. "And I've slept on worse than a wooden floor." As they settled in for the night, the rain intensified, drumming steadily on the roof. Thalia turned on her side, watching Jackson as he stretched out by the fire. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for the medical care, but for believing me, for helping when you had no reason to." Jackson met her gaze across the dim room. "Maybe I had more reason than you know," he replied cryptically, then added, "Get some sleep, Thalia. We've still got a long way to go." She nodded, closing her eyes, and soon her breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep. Jackson lay awake longer, listening to the storm and wondering what awaited them beyond the mountains. Blackwell didn't strike him as a man who would give up easily, especially with valuable mining claims at stake. Their journey to Nevada was just beginning, and the most dangerous part still lay ahead. Morning brought clearing skies and a visible improvement in Thalia's condition. The fever Jackson had feared never materialized, and though she moved stiffly, her color had returned and her eyes were bright and alert. "We should reach the Nevada border by nightfall if we maintain a steady pace," Jackson said as they ate a breakfast of the remaining stew. "From there, it's another day's ride to Carson City where we can find Porter." Thalia nodded, carefully stretching to test her wounded side. "The sooner we get these deeds registered properly, the better." She hesitated, then added, "Have you thought about what comes after?" "Once we've secured the claims," Jackson paused in packing their few belongings. It was a question he'd been avoiding. "I suppose I head back to my ranch, see what's left of it." "Alone?" Thalia asked, her voice carefully neutral. Their eyes met across the small cabin, and something unspoken passed between them, a possibility neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed. "That depends," Jackson finally said, his voice soft. Before Thalia could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. Jackson moved swiftly to the window, peering carefully through the dirty glass. "3 riders," he reported, his hand moving to his revolver. "Coming up the trail." Thalia joined him at the window, her face paling as she recognized the figures. "It's Blackwell and 2 of his men," she whispered. "How did they find us?" "Doesn't matter now," Jackson replied grimly, checking his weapon. "Cabin's got a root cellar like mine, trapdoor under that rug, get down there now." "I'm not hiding while you face them alone," Thalia protested, reaching for the shotgun. Jackson caught her arm gently but firmly. 3 against 1 are poor odds, but I can convince them I'm alone, just a traveler taking shelter. If they see you, they'll know instantly who you are. His eyes held hers. "Please, Thalia, trust me." After a moment's hesitation, she nodded, gathering the precious pouch of deeds before lifting the trapdoor and descending into the small space beneath the cabin floor. Jackson replaced the rug just as the sound of boots on the porch reached his ears. A heavy knock rattled the door. "Hello, the cabin," called a voice Jackson recognized as Blackwell's. Taking a deep breath, Jackson adopted a relaxed posture and opened the door. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, feigning surprise. Blackwell's eyes narrowed in recognition. "Mr. Winters, isn't it?" "The rancher from near Truckee." Jackson nodded, leaning casually against the doorframe, blocking the entrance. "That's right. Surprised to see you this far into the mountains, Mr. Blackwell." "I might say the same," Blackwell replied, his gaze moving past Jackson to survey what was visible of the cabin interior. "Long way from your cattle, aren't you? Tracking a mountain lion that's been preying on my herd," Jackson improvised smoothly. "Followed its trail up here before the rain washed it away. Figured I'd wait out the storm in this old cabin before heading back." One of Blackwell's companions, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, spoke up. "Funny coincidence, you being out here same time we're tracking our quarry." "What are you hunting?" Jackson asked innocently. "Not much game this high up." "Not what? Who?" Blackwell corrected, his pleasant tone at odds with the coldness in his eyes. "The young woman I mentioned in town. We found evidence suggesting she headed into these mountains." He paused. "Perhaps with a companion," Jackson shrugged. "Haven't seen anyone but you 3 since I left town." Blackwell studied him for a long moment, then smiled thinly. "Would you mind if we had a look inside, just to be thorough?" It wasn't a request, and Jackson knew refusing would only heighten their suspicions. He stepped aside, hand casually near his holster. "Help yourselves." The 3 men entered, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Jackson's heart raced at the thought of Thalia just below those boards, but he maintained his calm facade as Blackwell's men searched the small space. "Cozy place," Blackwell commented, running a finger along the dusty table. His gaze fell on the 2 bowls from breakfast. "You always eat twice when alone, Mr. Winters," Jackson smiled easily. "One for stew, one for coffee grounds, old habit from trail days." The scarred man emerged from checking the small storage area at the back. "Nothing there, boss." Blackwell nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Jackson's face. "Mr. Winters, I'm a businessman. I respect a man who knows how to negotiate. So let me be plain, if you're hiding Thalia Scott, tell me now, and there's $500 in it for you." "That's generous," Jackson replied, "but I can't help you with something I know nothing about." "1,000, Blackwell countered, "more money than you'd see in a year of ranching." "Like I said, she's a thief," Blackwell interrupted, his pleasant demeanor slipping. "And she's going to pay for what she's done. Anyone helping her will share her fate." The threat hung in the air between them. Jackson's fingers itched to draw his revolver, but he resisted. 3 against 1, as he'd told Thalia, were poor odds indeed. "I appreciate the warning," Jackson said evenly, "but it doesn't change the fact that I haven't seen your fugitive." Blackwell held his gaze for a long moment before nodding to his men. "We'll continue our search elsewhere." At the door, he turned back. "If you do happen to encounter Miss Scott, remember my offer. $1,000 can change a man's circumstances dramatically." "I'll keep that in mind," Jackson replied neutrally. The 3 men mounted their horses and rode back down the trail. Jackson watched until they disappeared from view before quickly closing the door and lifting the trapdoor. "They're gone," he said, helping Thalia climb out. She emerged, shaking slightly, her face pale. "He won't give up," she said quietly. "He'll keep searching." "Which is why we need to move," Jackson replied, already gathering their belongings. They're heading deeper into the mountains, but they'll realize their mistake eventually and double back. They packed swiftly, erasing all signs of Thalia's presence from the cabin, and were mounted and moving within minutes. Instead of continuing east along the main trail, Jackson led them south, following a barely visible path that wound through a dense section of forest. "This will take us to a different pass," he explained as they rode. "Longer route to Nevada, but less likely to cross paths with Blackwell again." Thalia nodded, her expression determined despite the lingering fear in her eyes. "He offered you a small fortune to betray me." "Not enough," Jackson replied simply. Thalia studied him from atop her horse. "Most men would disagree." "I'm not most men." "No," she said softly, "you're certainly not." They traveled steadily through the day, the path gradually descending as they left the highest parts of the mountains behind. The terrain changed from dense forest to more open country, with views stretching for miles across valleys and ridges. By late afternoon, they reached a high plateau that offered a panoramic vista of the land ahead, the Nevada Territory, with its distinctive sage-covered hills stretching toward the distant horizon. "We'll make camp in that grove of trees," Jackson decided, pointing to a cluster of junipers near a small creek. "Should be sheltered enough to risk a small fire tonight." As they dismounted, Thalia stumbled slightly, the long day of riding having taken its toll on her injured side. Jackson caught her arm, steadying her, and they found themselves standing closer than they had before, her face tilted up to his. For a breathless moment, neither moved. Then Jackson gently released her arm and stepped back. "I'll see to the horses," he said, his voice rougher than usual. Thalia nodded, a flush coloring her cheeks as she turned to gather firewood from the nearby trees. As darkness fell, they sat beside a small, carefully banked fire, eating the last of their provisions and planning the final leg of their journey. "Once we reach Carson City," Jackson explained, "we'll find Porter at the marshal's office. He's a good man, honest. If anyone can help secure your claims legally, it's him." "And if Blackwell follows us there?" Thalia asked. "Carson City isn't Sacramento," Jackson replied. "The law means something there, especially with silver and gold at stake. Porter won't be bought like that sheriff back in California." Thalia nodded, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. "My father always said the same, that there were still honest men in the territories." "I think he would have liked you, Jackson." "I wish I could have met him," Jackson said sincerely. "He raised a remarkable daughter." Their eyes met across the fire, and this time neither looked away. In the dancing light of the flames, something shifted between them, friendship deepening into something more complex, more profound. "When this is over," Thalia began hesitantly. "What will you do?" Jackson considered the question. "I've spent 8 years building a life in Truckee. It won't be easy to walk away from that. But if you had to," she pressed softly. He looked at her steadily. "Then I'd start again. Life's taught me that homes can be rebuilt. What matters are the people you share them with." The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Thalia opened her mouth to respond, but a distant sound caught their attention, the unmistakable report of a rifle, followed by shouting. "Someone's in trouble," Jackson said, rising quickly and kicking dirt over their fire. "Could be a traveler attacked by bandits." "Or it could be a trap," Thalia pointed out. Jackson nodded grimly. "Stay here with the horses. If I'm not back in 30 minutes, ride for Carson City without me. Find Porter." "I'm not leaving you," Thalia protested, reaching for the shotgun. "Thalia," Jackson said firmly, "those deeds are what matter. Your father died protecting them. Don't let that be in vain." Their eyes locked in silent argument before she finally nodded. 30 minutes, not a second longer. Jackson squeezed her hand briefly, then disappeared into the darkness, moving quietly toward the source of the disturbance. He crept through the scrubby junipers, keeping low and using the terrain for cover. The shouting had stopped, but occasional gunfire still punctuated the night, coming from a small ravine about a quarter-mile from their camp. As he neared the edge of the ravine, Jackson could make out figures moving below 5 or 6 men engaged in what appeared to be a standoff. Keeping to the shadows, he edged closer until conversations became audible. "Just hand over the saddlebags and we'll let you ride out of here," called one man, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Federal property," came the response. "Drop your weapons or face charges." Jackson froze, recognizing the second voice, Elliot Porter. What were the odds his friend would be in these mountains the same night they were crossing? Carefully positioning himself, Jackson could now see Porter pinned down behind a boulder, exchanging fire with what appeared to be common bandits. Without hesitation, Jackson drew his revolver and fired 3 quick shots into the air. "Marshall's reinforcements," he shouted. "Drop your weapons." The unexpected intervention caused momentary confusion among the bandits, which Porter immediately exploited, rising from cover to fire at the closest attacker. The man fell with a cry, and his companions, now believing themselves surrounded, quickly scattered into the darkness. Porter. Jackson called, sliding down the ravine slope. "It's Jackson Winters." The lawman emerged cautiously from behind the boulder, rifle at the ready until he recognized Jackson. "Winters?" Porter exclaimed in disbelief. "What in blazes are you doing out here?" "I could ask you the same," Jackson replied, scanning the darkness for any remaining threats. "Long way from your jurisdiction, aren't you?" Porter holstered his weapon, grimacing as he favored his left leg. "Escorting mining documents to Carson City. Got ambushed by those road agents." He gestured to where his horse stood nervously nearby, laden with saddlebags. "You saved my bacon, old friend." "You're hit," Jackson observed, noticing the blood staining Porter's trouser leg. "Just a graze," Porter dismissed, though his pale face suggested otherwise. "Did you really bring reinforcements?" Jackson hesitated, then decided on honesty. "No, but I do have someone with me who needs your help, someone being pursued by dangerous men." Porter raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like a story worth hearing." "It is," Jackson confirmed, "and one better told somewhere safer than this ravine." He helped Porter mount his horse, then led the way back to where Thalia waited anxiously, shotgun at the ready. "Jackson," she exclaimed in relief as they approached, then noticed Porter. "Who's this?" "Thalia Scott, meet Elliot Porter," Jackson introduced them. "The very man we were riding to Carson City to find." Thalia lowered the shotgun, eyes wide with surprise. "The marshal here," Porter tipped his hat. "Miss Scott. Seems we have mutual interests to discuss, but first," he winced as he dismounted. "I could use some assistance with this leg." They quickly re-established their camp, lighting the fire again to provide light as Jackson examined Porter's wound. Like Porter had claimed, it was indeed just a graze, but it had bled significantly and needed cleaning. As Jackson tended to the wound, Thalia explained their situation to Porter, her father's murder, the deeds, Blackwell's pursuit, and their journey through the mountains. Porter listened attentively, his weathered face grave. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "Thomas Blackwell, name's familiar. Think there's been talk about his business practices in mining circles." He looked at the pouch Thalia clutched protectively. "Those deeds legal?" "Absolutely," she affirmed. "My father earned them fairly through his engineering work. Every claim was properly documented and witnessed." "Then we'll make sure they stay yours," Porter assured her. "Carson City's just half a day's ride from here. Once we reach the territorial offices, we can register them properly. Blackwell won't be able to contest them without exposing his crimes." Relief washed over Thalia's face. "Thank you," she said softly. "Don't thank me yet," Porter cautioned. "Blackwell's still out there, and he sounds like the type who might try one last desperate move before admitting defeat." "We'll be ready," Jackson stated firmly. They took turns keeping watch through the night, with Jackson insisting that Thalia rest to preserve her strength for the final leg of their journey. As dawn approached, he found himself sharing the watch with Porter, the two men sitting quietly by the rekindled fire. "She's quite a woman," Porter observed, nodding toward Thalia's sleeping form. "Yes," Jackson agreed simply. Porter studied his friend's face in the firelight. "Known you 6 years now, never seen you look at anyone the way you look at her." Jackson didn't deny it. "Things change." "That they do," Porter agreed thoughtfully. "You planning to go back to that ranch of yours when this is over?" "Not sure anymore," Jackson admitted. "Depends on how things settle. Porter nodded, understanding the unspoken implications. Well, for what it's worth, I think you two make a good match, both too stubborn for your own good. Jackson smiled slightly at that, his gaze returning to Thalia. We should wake her. Need to get moving before Blackwell picks up our trail again. They broke camp as the first light of dawn crept across the eastern sky, packing their few belongings and mounting their horses. Porter led the way, guiding them along the most direct route to Carson City. The terrain gradually transitioned from the pine-covered mountains to the more arid landscape of Nevada territory, with sagebrush and occasional stands of juniper dotting the rolling hills. By mid-morning, they could see Carson City in the distance, nestled at the base of the mountains. Almost there, Porter encouraged as they stopped briefly to rest the horses. Thalia's face showed both exhaustion and determination as she gazed at the distant settlement. After all this, it's hard to believe we might actually succeed. We're not there yet, Jackson cautioned, scanning the horizon behind them. Something had been nagging at him for the past hour, a sense of being watched that he couldn't shake. Porter noticed his vigilance. See something? Not sure, Jackson replied, eyes narrowing as he studied a dust cloud in the distance. But we might have company. Porter pulled out a small spyglass and focused it on the dust cloud. His expression hardened. Riders, 4 of them pushing their horses hard. Blackwell, Thalia whispered, her hand instinctively moving to the pouch of deeds. Can we outrun them? Jackson asked Porter, knowing their own mounts were tired from the journey. Porter considered, then shook his head. Not with my horse carrying double and your animals already weary. He studied the terrain ahead. But we might outsmart them. There's a narrow canyon about 2 miles ahead, leads directly to the main road into Carson City. If we can reach it first, we can set up an ambush. Jackson nodded grimly. Let's move. They pushed their horses as hard as they dared, making for the canyon Porter had described. The dust cloud behind them grew steadily larger. Blackwell's men were gaining. The canyon appeared ahead, a narrow passage between towering rock walls, the perfect place for a defensive stand. They reached it just as the pursuing riders came within rifle range, a shot kicking up dirt near Thalia's horse. In here, Porter directed, leading them into the canyon. About 100 yards in, he pointed to a narrow ledge above the trail. Up there, Winters. You can cover the entrance while I get Miss Scott to town. Jackson started to protest the idea of separating from Thalia, going against every protective instinct he'd developed, but Porter cut him off. Those deeds need to reach the territorial office, he insisted. I'm a lawman, my presence makes it official. You're the best shot I know. Buy us the time we need. After a moment's hesitation, Jackson nodded. Go, I'll hold them here. Thalia dismounted and approached him, her eyes filled with concern. Jackson, he met her gaze steadily. I'll be right behind you, he promised. Go with Porter, get those deeds registered. Instead of replying, she reached up and pulled him down into a brief, fierce kiss. That's a promise, she whispered against his lips. Come back to me. Then she was gone, mounting her horse and following Porter deeper into the canyon, where a second trail branched off toward town. Jackson quickly scaled the rock face to the ledge Porter had indicated, positioning himself with a clear view of the canyon entrance. He checked his revolver and rifle, calculating how many shots he could afford to take. He didn't have to wait long. Blackwell and his 3 remaining men appeared at the canyon mouth, slowing their horses as they scanned the passage ahead cautiously. They went this way, the scarred man declared, pointing at the fresh hoofprints in the dirt. Blackwell nodded. Carefully, gentlemen, this is perfect terrain for an ambush. Jackson allowed them to advance about 50 yards into the canyon before calling out, That's far enough, Blackwell. The 4 men immediately sought cover behind boulders, scanning the canyon walls. Winters, Blackwell called back, recognizing his voice. I should have known you were helping her. Last chance to turn back, Jackson warned. Porter's taking her and those deeds to Carson City right now. It's over, Blackwell laughed harshly. Nothing's over until I say it is. Porter's just 1 man wounded from what my scouts told me. We can still catch them. Not if I have anything to say about it, Jackson replied, firing a shot that struck the ground inches from Blackwell's boot. 4 against 1, Cowboy, the scarred man shouted. Bad odds for you. To emphasize the point, one of Blackwell's men fired in Jackson's direction, the bullet chipping stone near his head. What followed was a tense standoff, with Jackson using his elevated position to keep Blackwell's group pinned at the canyon entrance. He fired sparingly, making each shot count, while they wasted ammunition trying to locate his exact position. Time was what mattered now. Every minute he delayed them was another minute for Thalia and Porter to reach Carson City. Jackson knew he couldn't hold them indefinitely, but he didn't need to. He just needed to buy enough time. After what felt like hours but was likely only 20 minutes, Blackwell tried a different approach. Winters, he called. Let's be reasonable. What has Thalia Scott offered you that I can't double? Those deeds are worth a fortune. Not interested in your blood money, Blackwell, Jackson replied, punctuating his refusal with another well-placed shot that sent one of the men scrambling for better cover. Everyone has a price, Blackwell insisted. Name yours. Jackson's response was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats from deeper in the canyon, multiple horses approaching rapidly. For a moment, his heart sank, fearing Blackwell had somehow outflanked him. Then he saw the distinctive hats and badges of the Carson City lawmen, led by a familiar figure. U.S. Marshal, Porter's voice boomed through the canyon. Drop your weapons. Blackwell and his men found themselves caught between Jackson's position and half a dozen armed lawmen. After a tense moment, the scarred man dropped his gun, followed reluctantly by the others. Only Blackwell remained defiant. This is a misunderstanding, he began, still clutching his revolver. I'm pursuing a thief, save it for the judge, Porter cut him off. Thomas Blackwell, you're under arrest for the murder of Edward Scott, attempted murder of Thalia Scott, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Blackwell's face contorted with rage. You have no proof. We have Miss Scott's testimony, Porter replied calmly, and telegraph confirmation from Sacramento that your alibi for the night of the murder doesn't hold water. He nodded to his deputies. Take them in. As the lawmen disarmed and bound Blackwell and his men, Jackson descended from his perch, relief washing over him. Porter approached, extending his hand. Good work holding them off, the marshal said as they shook hands. Miss Scott's at the territorial office now, filing those deeds. Blackwell's claims are being nullified as we speak. She's safe then? Jackson asked, the tension of the past days finally catching up with him. Porter nodded. Safe and asking for you, quite insistently, I might add, he smiled knowingly. Seems you made quite an impression. Jackson watched as the deputies led the prisoners away, Blackwell's venomous glare promising retribution even in defeat. It's really over, Porter confirmed. The law's clear on this one. Those mines are legally hers now, documented and registered. He clapped Jackson on the shoulder. Come on, there's someone waiting for you in town. The ride to Carson City was mercifully uneventful, with Jackson and Porter trailing behind the deputies and their prisoners. As they entered the bustling territorial capital, Jackson was struck by how much had changed in the few years since his last visit. Silver discoveries had transformed the once small settlement into a growing city, with substantial buildings replacing the earlier wooden structures. Porter led him to the territorial offices, a handsome stone building on the main street. Inside, they found Thalia in conversation with a bespectacled official, signing the last of what appeared to be numerous documents. She looked up as they entered, her face lighting with relief when she saw Jackson. Without a word, she crossed the room and threw her arms around him, heedless of the curious onlookers. You're all right, she breathed against his chest. I promised I'd come back, he reminded her, holding her carefully, mindful of her injury. The official cleared his throat. Miss Scott, if you'll just sign here, the process will be complete. Your father's claims are now officially registered in your name. Thalia reluctantly stepped back from Jackson to complete the final signature. The official stamped the documents with a flourish. Congratulations, Miss Scott. You are now the legal owner of 5 silver mines valued at approximately $200,000. Jackson couldn't hide his surprise at the figure. Thalia Scott wasn't just the owner of a few modest claims, she was suddenly one of the wealthiest people in the territory. "Thank you," Thalia said to the official, then turned back to Jackson and Porter. "I couldn't have done this without either of you." "Just doing my job, Miss Scott," Porter replied with a smile, "though I believe Jackson here went well beyond duty." A comfortable room at Carson City's finest hotel awaited them, arranged by Porter as a courtesy to his key witness against Blackwell. After days on the trail, the prospect of clean sheets and hot water seemed like unimaginable luxury. "I'll leave you to rest," Porter said as he showed them to the room. "Trial proceedings will begin tomorrow, but they shouldn't take long. We have solid evidence, and Blackwell's men are already turning on each other, hoping for leniency." After Porter left, Jackson and Thalia found themselves alone for the first time since their journey began, standing awkwardly in the well-appointed room. "You should bathe first," Jackson offered, gesturing to the steaming tub behind a screen that hotel staff had prepared. "Your wound needs proper cleaning," Thalia nodded gratefully. "Help me change the bandage after, of course." While Thalia bathed, Jackson stood by the window, gazing out at the bustling street below. His thoughts were a jumble of relief, exhaustion, and uncertainty about what came next. The woman he had found trembling beneath his porch just days ago was now a wealthy mine owner, her future secure. His own future felt suddenly undefined, his simple ranch life in Truckee both appealing and somehow insufficient after all they'd experienced together. Jackson. He turned to find Thalia emerging from behind the screen, dressed in a simple nightgown provided by the hotel. Her hair hung damp around her shoulders, and without the dirt of travel, the natural beauty of her features was even more apparent. "Let me see that wound," he said, retrieving fresh bandages from the supplies Porter had left. Thalia sat on the edge of the bed, wincing slightly as she lifted the edge of her nightgown to expose the injured side. The stitches had held and the inflammation had subsided significantly. "Healing nicely," Jackson observed, carefully applying a clean bandage. "You'll have a scar, but no lasting damage." "Another memory," she said softly. His fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary on her skin, and their eyes met. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words. "Thalia," he began hesitantly, "about what happens next, I meant what I said before," she interrupted, taking his hand. "That kiss was a promise." Jackson sat beside her on the bed, still holding her hand. "You're a wealthy woman now, you could go anywhere, do anything. And what about you?" She asked. "Will you return to your ranch?" He considered the question. "It's all I've known for 8 years, but, she prompted when he hesitated. "But I'm starting to think home isn't necessarily a place," he admitted. "It's where you feel you belong." Thalia's eyes softened. "And where do you feel you belong, Jackson Winters?" Instead of answering with words, he leaned forward and kissed her gently at first, then with growing intensity as she responded, her arms sliding around his neck to draw him closer. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I think I'm starting to figure that out." Thalia smiled, her eyes bright with emotion. "Good, because I have plans that require your assistance, Mr. Winters." "What kind of plans?" he asked, intrigued by the determination in her voice. "My father didn't just want those mines for the silver," she explained. "He had designs for a new kind of mining operation safer for the men who work below ground, more efficient in extraction. The kind of operation that could change how mining is done throughout the West." She squeezed his hand. "I need a partner I can trust to help make his vision reality." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "A mining engineer I'm not." "No," she agreed with a smile. "But you're honest, capable, and the bravest man I've ever known. The technical aspects can be hired. Character can't." The offer hung between them, not just a business proposition, but the possibility of a shared future neither had anticipated when fate brought them together beneath his porch. "What about your ranch?" Thalia asked when he remained silent. Jackson thought of his small cabin, the herd he'd built so carefully over the years, the solitary life he'd grown accustomed to. Then he looked at the woman before him, her eyes reflecting a future bright with possibility. "Ranches can be sold," he said simply, Or bought again if mining doesn't suit me. Thalia's smile could have lit the darkening room. Is that a yes? Jackson nodded, drawing her closer. That's a yes, to all of it, whatever it turns out to be. Their lips met again, sealing a promise that had begun in danger but now opened into hope. The trial of Thomas Blackwell was surprisingly brief. With multiple witnesses, including Porter and other lawmen, testifying to his crimes and his own men turning state's evidence in exchange for reduced sentences, the outcome was never in doubt. He was sentenced to hang for the murder of Edward Scott, a fate he faced with the same arrogance that had characterized his life. Thalia attended the sentencing, her face solemn but composed as justice was delivered for her father. Jackson stood beside her, his steady presence a comfort as the chapter closed on the tragedy that had brought them together. "It's truly over now," she said as they left the courthouse, stepping into the bright Nevada sunshine. "A new beginning," Jackson corrected gently, taking her hand. They spent the following weeks in Carson City, making arrangements for the mines Thalia now owned. True to her word, she hired experienced engineers to implement her father's designs, but it was Jackson she consulted on all major decisions, valuing his practical insight and unwavering integrity. Word of the innovative methods being employed at the Scott mines spread quickly through mining circles, bringing investors and curious engineers to witness the operations firsthand. Within months, Thalia's reputation as a forward-thinking mine owner was established throughout the territory. Jackson adapted to his new role with surprising ease, his natural leadership abilities earning the respect of the miners and foremen alike. What began as a temporary arrangement gradually solidified into a partnership that transcended business. 6 months after their arrival in Carson City, on a crisp autumn evening, Jackson proposed. They were sitting on the porch of the house they had built overlooking the main Scott mine, a comfortable dwelling that combined the practical simplicity Jackson preferred with touches of elegance Thalia enjoyed. "I'm not a man of fancy words," he said, taking her hand as the sunset painted the mountains in gold and crimson. "But I know what I want, and that's a life with you, Thalia Scott." Her answer was immediate and joyful. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony attended by Porter, now promoted to chief marshal for the territory, and the loyal workers from the mines. Life settled into a rhythm different from what either had imagined for themselves, yet somehow perfectly suited to who they had become together. The mines prospered under their joint management, with Thalia's father's innovations proving even more successful than anticipated. 3 years after their marriage, they welcomed their first child, a son they named Edward Jackson Winters, in honor of both their fathers. A daughter, Clara, followed 2 years later, completing their family. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Jackson and Thalia would sit on their porch and recall the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. "You ever miss your ranch?" Thalia would ask, though she knew the answer. "Sometimes," Jackson would admit. "The simplicity of it, but not the solitude." He would pull her closer. "Never that." On the 10th anniversary of their first meeting, they made a journey back to Truckee, curious to see what remained of Jackson's former home. The cabin still stood, though weathered by years of mountain seasons, and new owners had expanded the cattle operation significantly. "Strange to think it all began here," Thalia mused as they stood at the edge of the property. "Me hiding under your porch, bleeding and terrified." "Best thing that ever happened to me," Jackson replied, his arm around her waist. Thalia leaned into his embrace. "Even with the gunfights and near-death experiences, even with those," he confirmed, "some treasures are worth fighting for." As they turned their horses back toward the train station that would take them home to Nevada, Jackson took one last look at the cabin where he had lived alone for so many years. What had seemed like contentment then paled in comparison to the life he had found with Thalia. The solitary cowboy who once valued his isolation above all else now measured his wealth in different terms: the love of a brave woman, the laughter of their children, and the knowledge that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most perfect endings. The Scott Winters mines continued to prosper, eventually becoming one of the most successful operations in Nevada territory. But more importantly, the family that had formed in the aftermath of tragedy thrived, their bond forged in danger and strengthened through years of shared joy and purpose. And occasionally, when new acquaintances asked how they had met, Jackson and Thalia would exchange a private smile before he would say simply, "I found her hiding under my porch one rainy night." The full story, with its bullets and bloodshed, desperate pursuits and last-minute rescues, was theirs alone. A reminder that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a single act of compassion. In the end, it wasn't silver that proved to be their greatest treasure, but the life they built together, a life neither could have imagined on that fateful night when a wounded woman sought shelter beneath a stranger's porch, and a solitary cowboy found not just someone to save, but someone who would, in her own way, save him too.